Please, Sylvia.
I brought this with in case technology fails. Thank you very much, Robbie and Sue, for inviting me to be this year's Fuchs Lecture. And thank the guest committee too, because it's a committee decision. I actually owe a big debt to all those who've accompanied me on this journey, this group analytic journey. And those are my teachers, Lisa sitting there. Malcolm can't be here today. He was sent his apologies to me. Teachers, supervisors, and colleagues, colleagues I've worked with, colleagues in my network, and very much my former students and patients. I owe them a great debt, and my journey couldn't have been complete without them. They've made me the group analyst I am. Okay, the title of my talk is The Times They Are A-Changing, Evolving Group Analytic Identity. Evolving Group Analytic Identity, the subtitle of my topic, emerged last year when my sense of identity was seriously challenged by Brexit. Britain joined the European community 3 years after I arrived in the United Kingdom as an immigrant from South Africa. And so the UK, as part of Europe, has since then always been where I belonged. I associated my adopted home with democratic and liberal values, and in particular, with being a relatively tolerant society that embraced difference and promoted inclusion. Brexit represents a threat to these values, and for me, harks back towards the values and norms of my former country. My conflicted social identity stands in contrast to my professional identity, which, as a clinician strongly identified with group analysis, which I happened to come into contact with in 1972 at about the same time as Britain joined the EU, that's been relatively conflict-free. My identity, I've certainly been involved in lots of conflicts, but that's different. The Times They Are A-Changing, as all will know, comes from a Bob Dylan protest song written in the 60s, in the same year, 1964, as the publication of Fuchs's Therapeutic Group Analysis. In a chapter on psychotherapy in the 60s, Fuchs describes that decade as a period of rapid and unprecedented change. This describes my experience, not only of the 60s, which I did experience as a period of rapid and accelerated change, but particularly of the 21st century, unprecedented change for me. Oh, sorry. For me, there are echoes of the 60s in current times. On the political front, current mass migrations and the accompanying rise of right-wing movements, the reassertion of nationalist sentiments and attempts to redraw national boundaries echo the 50s and 60s post-colonial opening up of borders and migrations of peoples alongside the rise of anti-immigrant movements in the UK, intolerance of difference and racial hatred. This was the time of Enoch Powell, his Rivers of Blood speech, etc. On the socio-cultural level, the dramatic increase in the new millennium of the flexibility and fluidity of the ways that we construct ourselves and present ourselves, including our gendered self, in new acceptable forms of partnerships and family constellations, in changed modes of communicating, relating, and grouping. These all parallel the dramatic changes in the 60s as contraception uncoupled sex from marriage and childbearing, and with the possibilities of delayed childbearing facilitating change in gendered power relations. Sexual liberation movements of the 60s are paralleled by current escalation in cyberspace of sexual interaction and experimentation. There's really a lot of it on the net now, but actually in contrast to the 60s without actual physical contact. So it's sexual experimentation without bodies being involved, mostly visual. In the mental health field, we saw in the 50s and 60s the established order challenged. Psychiatry had its anti-psychiatry movement. Group work and therapeutic communities were in the ascendant. Psychotherapy, analytic and other, was growing, diversifying, and extending its reach. Now, growth in attention to mental health has created a heavy demand for services. And in the new millennium, in contrast to earlier decades, brief interventions that promise quick and easy solutions have replaced high-quality and more expensive psychotherapies, while increasingly technology is used to satisfy these demands at low cost. I get adverts through the door offering online counseling on the health service. So, what does it mean to be a group analyst or group analytic psychotherapist now, in this time? Has group analytic identity transformed? And if so, how? I intend today to consider how our practice traditions and our theoretical base have adapted to challenges from within the group analytic field and challenges from without, to look back over the decades and forward to challenges ahead. Being involved in group analytic training for 3 decades, questions of group analytic identity have always been there for me, both in the background and the foreground. Training involves transmission of group analytic ideas and practices, and can be a breeding ground for creative growth or for rigidification. Fuchs's organic model of man as an open system in dynamic equilibrium, creatively adapting to a changing environment, provides us with a template to view how group analysis has evolved and whether it has creatively adapted to our changing environment or not. My view is inevitably subjective and based on experience of group analysis in the UK. It's a very UK-based analysis. I hope that our study day will bring different stories and perspectives on the evolution of group analytic identity in different countries and in different contexts. As some of you are aware, I've been particularly preoccupied by the impact of the digital revolution on all aspects of our lives, and have spoken about this at different points in recent years. Times they are a-changing for me is directly linked to the communications revolution. Mobile technologies become part of our environment and poses an evolutionary challenge to adapt. We are now an incredibly complex networked global society, able to connect instantly across continents and time zones, a far cry from the nodes in the network, in a network of Fuchs's time. The relatively wide global access to and use of, increasingly as we speak, online communicating and the internet is profoundly changing the way we communicate and group together. And I believe that we're engaged in a shift, a paradigmatic shift at the level of the foundation matrix, one that strikes at our heart, communication and relational networks. And I believe that increasing use of online and internet communication will slowly change the way that we're wired. The extraordinary plasticity of the brain is now well established, and Hebb's law, cells that fire together, wire together, confirmed. There are now very few areas of our lives that are not facilitated and influenced by the internet. I wish to continue the conversation initiated in last year's Fuchs lecture and response, to consider some of the implications for group analysis of these changed modes and patterns of communicating, socializing, and grouping together. But first I wish to look back and to track group analytic identity, have a look at group analytic identity, the group analytic matrix. Firstly, in relation to group membership, which is what helps define us. Identity has been a popular theme in recent years and is defined in many ways, in different discourses, many different ways. The dynamic, ever-changing nature of identity is best, I think, described by Erik Erikson in his prologue to Identity, Youth and Crisis. And to quote, "Nor can we separate the identity crisis in individual life and contemporary crises in historical development, because the two help to define each other and are truly relative to each other. In fact, the whole interplay between the psychological and the social, the developmental and the historical, for which identity formation is of prototypical significance, could be conceptualized only as a kind of psychosocial relativity." When referring to group analytic collective identity, I'm considering our essential core similarities, what we hold in common and how we define ourselves as different to other analytic group and psychotherapy approaches. And alongside our conceptual framework, our group norms and values and traditions, our collective identity is forged in the ongoing, evolving interrelationships amongst us and the emotional investment that accompanies it. I felt that very strongly tonight, just before the lecture, feeling the connections with so many different people. It is in the groups we belong to that identities are continually constructed and reconstructed. And as we know, the birth of the group analytic we identity coincided with the establishment of the Group Analytic Society in 1952. The first organization, I think, specifically designated as group analytic. Since that time, different kinds of group analytic organizations have been established, which vary in how they define their membership boundaries, their inclusion-exclusion criteria. GASI, constituted as a scientific body of interested persons, is characterized by an inclusive, relatively open membership. And it continues to thrive, as we heard earlier, as the main and now international slow open group analytic matrix with its journal and newsletter and ritual annual workshops, lectures, symposia, bringing together an international meeting of group analytic minds. On the other hand, group analytic training institutions, first set up in London in 1971 and then extending to many parts of Europe and beyond, saw the spread of a different kind of group analytic organization. The training institution places greater emphasis on transmission of ideas and practices, on standards of practice, and on assessment, assessing who's suitable for training, who's adequately internalized a group analytic approach, etc. The criteria for membership inclusion are more elaborate and selective and highly regulated, both from within the institution, fulfilling requirements for completion of training, and from the wider psychotherapy context with its guidelines, codes of practice, and accrediting function. I think this takes group analytic identity deeper into the political arena and subject to the power dynamics, the rivalries over status and influence, both within the group analytic field and in the wider professional field. I just want to mention two further group analytic organizations for completeness. There's the European Association for Transcultural Group Analysis, which was set up in 1982, and Dennis Brown had a lot to do with setting it up, to study the effects of cultures on the construction of the self. Kurt Huisman, our speaker for the study day tomorrow, was a founder member, and I'm hoping we might hear more about this from him tomorrow. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, Egerton was established as a specialist group analytic network of training bodies with delegates engaged in dialogue and exchange about training. This was set up in the context of changing political boundaries, the dissolution of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Empire, and a move towards greater internationalism and globalization. Egerton initially set up to challenge the dominance of London and establish more egalitarian relationships between training institutes, has resisted entering the power political accrediting mode, and retained an identity as an arena for the establishment of standards and for the exchange of ideas and resources and changing interdependencies. These group analytic organizations, sometimes in conflict with one another, sometimes in collaborative mode, provide a space where we exchange ideas, resources, where we rival and conflict with each other and articulate our differences. These provide the crucibles for the ongoing forging of our professional identities. And now, from Fuchs to Fuchs. A brief look at the identity template provided by our founding father, Fuchs. Fuchs didn't himself write about his own identity issues. As a German Jewish immigrant to the UK in 1933, such issues must have been prominent for him. Identities are forged when we come up against difference. Immigration experience will call for a reconstruction of the self, loss of home, roots, and familiar connections, and the need to adapt to a different culture and language. This will challenge the sense of self and identity. What we do know is that Fuchs chose to change his name from Fuchs to Fuchs, Fuchs, not an unusual practice, and in so doing attempted to put into the background one particular signifier of his German identity, and hence to reduce the power of the name to act as a trigger for projections and transference. Fuchs's disidentification with the Germany of the 30s is evident too in his writings, in his anti-authoritarian stance, the emphasis on democratic leadership and principles, the concern about power relationships and potential misuse of power between analyst and member, group analyst and group member. His positive identity, German identity elements are not directly expressed in his writings, but his valuing of German culture and thought is implicit, I think, in his writings. Fuchs's approach resonated for me. Over 25 years ago, in my first venture into private practice, I took over a group that had been set up and conducted for some years by a Black Caribbean group analyst who was returning to the Caribbean. It is an ongoing group, though none of the original members are still in it, except me. A black therapist with a background of enslavement and being colonized, passes the baton to a white therapist identified with racist and oppressive colonial masters. The group managed the transition in that there were no dropouts, and what I remember was some play in the group with ideas of white and black witches, without either of us getting fixed into the good versus evil position. But what became clear to me in time was how different our styles were, and how, for some members, her style, a powerful presence and no-nonsense approach, provided greater safety. Whereas for other members, my style, more in the background, analyzing boundary transgressions rather than prescribing rules, provided greater safety. This experience initiated an ongoing self-conscious exploration of my group analytic identity, particularly in relation to what kind of authority I am. Did my disidentification with the abusive authority of the South African apartheid regime in some way affect my capacity to be authoritative? I leave that as a question. We rely on Fuchs's writing and on those of some of his early followers to inform a group analytic approach and a group analytic identity. Although focusing on Fuchs in this talk, I consider the work of some of the early pioneer authors and teachers to be of major significance in establishing a group analytic approach and identity. To name a few, and this is not a complete list for me, but it's a few: Malcolm Pines and Robin Skinner, Dennis Brown, Lee Silhurst, Lionel Krieger, Pat Damari for his work on dialogue and median large groups aiming at humanizing society, ever more urgent, I think, in our contemporary society. And next generation authors such as Ralph Stacey and Gerhard Wilkie for their development of a group analytic perspective on organizational functioning, and many others. Returning to Fuchs. 15 years after immigrating to the UK, his first book appeared. And in both his first and his last book, he put method into the center. Group analytic method, creating a group analytic situation, a dynamic matrix, was extensively elaborated in all Fuchs's writing. A method that both allowed for different views of the group process, for translating unconscious communication, and that maximized potential for analytic reflection and the generation of meaning. The role and function of the group analytic therapist, the conductor, was also extensively elaborated by Fuchs. It was a method syntonic with his theoretical approach and assumptions that privileged the social, the group matrix, as both the appropriate object of study and as the primary therapeutic resource. Theory focuses on the dynamics of communicational and relational matrices, the nature of mind as transpersonal processes, and psychopathology as arising from social matrices in their current evolving and historical aspects. I think this congruence between theory and method was one of Fuchs's greatest contributions. As a consequence of this prioritizing of method, group analysis, unlike psychoanalysis, has, I think, its most significant influence experientially rather than through its literature. My interest in psychoanalysis came through reading Freud. My engagement with group analysis came through experiencing group analytic therapy groups as a participant, observer, and as a patient. Group analytic theory has not yet, in my view, through its literature, significantly permeated the wider culture beyond the analytic and psychotherapy field, but rather it is known in its clinical application as a special form of group therapy rather than a comprehensive approach to human relations. This may be changing with the extension of its theoretical base and with its recent interdisciplinary links with the arts, literature, music, and film, and with the move from the consulting room into the community. Continuing on the identity theme and looking at essential elements of group analytic identity. What we hold in common, what binds us together in our collective identity, is a model of man, as I've said before, as an open system in dynamic equilibrium, and a set of basic assumptions and principles. Group analysis provides a frame into which other discourses can be absorbed with varying degrees of dissonance and integration. A frame that marries open systemic and holistic Gestalt approaches with an appreciation of the permeating effects of the social and of the unconscious forces that shape our individual and collective beings. I think it is this frame that defines our core identity. And it is in the here and now of our experiential groups, led by our therapists, supervisors, teachers, and workshop leaders, that transmission takes place, and we internalize a group analytic model and way of relating. A further assumption, not usually specified in standard descriptions of the group analytic approach, and for me one of the most essential defining features, is the assumption that human relations, in both their conscious and unconscious process, can be understood by finding meaning in the social context, both current and historical. A multi-perspectival view is built into group analytic method. We are exhorted to view group process from current, part object, transference, and primordial levels. And the possibility of further viewing levels or perspectives is implicit as society evolves and changes. Martin Wiegmann, in a chapter from one of his recent books, makes a convincing case for such perspectivism having its philosophical roots in Nietzsche's perspectivism. The precursor to my own group analytic identity was an early belief in the defining effects of one's own perceptual and conceptual viewing position or frame. In my brief spell in the 60s as a junior lecturer in Cape Town University Psychology Department, I was responsible for the first-year experimental psychology course. That was my punishment. I designed and introduced an experiment on experimenter effect designed to demonstrate that even in the learning of nonsense syllables, experimenter expectations affected the outcomes. So the notion of the objective scientist or analyst was always questionable for me. The observer is always part of the field. Group analysis has often been described as a broad church, accommodating differences of professional background. Many of us belong to more than one professional group and professional organization, differences of psychoanalytic persuasion, differences in how we hold the balance between the individual and the group, the I and the we, the internal and the external, instinct or fantasy versus social context and environment. Group analysis views polarities such as these as in a constant dialectic, co-constructed rather than in a binary either-or conflict. And these differences define our individual, unique group analytic identity and articulate some of the fault lines along which our individual and collective identities can polarize, fracture, or fragment under conditions of stress or threat or constraint. Our study day provides an opportunity for live exploration of our identities. Evolving identity grows out of conflict and contradiction. But we haven't had the equivalent of the Freud-Klein controversial discussions in psychoanalysis. Our ideological identity conflicts have played out in the literature. For example, with Farad Dalal's overview of the contradictions between the Freudian and Fuchsian paradigms, encapsulated in the notions of an orthodox and radical Fuchs, and with Nitson's challenges regarding aggressive forces and authority relations in groups. Identity conflicts have also played out in relation to methodological issues, and this is what I'd like to look at next. I'd like to look at some of the challenges to group analytic identity from within our field and from without. To start with internal debates. Within the group analytic field, in the UK, rivalries over who has had the best group analytic training centered on the diverse views about the adequacy of different training structures. Block versus continuous, stranger groups versus personal experience therapy groups. This debate only really took hold when block training was introduced into the UK in Manchester, and questions arose about whether different training structures should lead to inclusion as equal members of the London IGA. The fact that the debate didn't take place years earlier when the UK was exporting block training to Europe is telling. Clearly in part linked to the absence of competition for jobs and status with our European colleagues, perhaps also an expression of the colonial template. In my view, the emphasis in the UK on the slow open group analytic stranger group as the ideal, the gold standard, became rather rigidified in group analytic training, being simply handed down as the analytic methodology, the group analytic methodology, rather than a method that maximizes therapeutic and particularly analytic potential, but could be adapted to meet different aims, therapeutic and other, in different contexts. Methodology lent itself to rigidification, as it was much more clearly defined and elaborated by Fuchs than his theoretical writings. There were other pressures, such as the move towards including a second applied group in training courses, and more recently, debate over whether the inclusion of an intermediate skills-based group analytic training that didn't require accompanying contiguous experience in group analytic therapy to diploma level. There was concern that this endangered group analytic identity. Although driven by political forces, I consider that the above challenges encouraged group analysis in the UK to think outside the box of the classical stranger group. I think one of the key points in the evolution of group analytic identity has been the challenge to traditional group analytic training structures to adapt creatively to different frequency intensity models and different applications and contexts. Looking at some of the external pressures, which we're all very aware of, different psychotherapy modalities have always been in potential competition with one another. Such rivalries, for example, over who is qualified to practice what, tend to intensify in recessionary times. The major challenge to group analysis has emanated from the political arena, government endorsement of CBT as the recommended talk therapy, together with the establishment in the UK of the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, recommending therapies based on evidence-based practice, have influenced the status and extent of provision of group analytic therapies, certainly in the health service. In these latter decades, we see the promotion from the political establishment of short-term treatments, CBT treatments, more accessible to quantitative research methods. Of course, the main threat coming from short-termism and increasingly manualized and formulaic techniques is to the analytic function, so at the core of our group analytic approach. Keeping alive our classical long-term slow open groups alongside those modified in structure and aim is essential to protect against an erosion of our essence. Now, I'd like to look at how we've moved from the clinical to the psychosocial. The shift in focus in recent decades from group analysis as a clinical method to group analysis as an approach to the understanding of society and its groupings, from the clinical arena to the psychosocial field, is evident in its increasing application to groups in organizations, institutions, and in the community. Some examples of such new developments are the setting up of reflective citizens groups, Marina Mojovic's project, a proposed large group training, training in reflective practice in organizations, workshops for those working with traumatized groups such as refugees, and many more. The language used is that of dialogue and reflection rather than transference analysis, and aims are directed towards facilitating working relationships or encouraging communities to integrate, to tolerate difference, and to recognize its potential for enrichment. Accompanying these developments is a burst of new thinking in the literature, reminiscent of earlier thrusts in theory development that culminated in the publication of The Psyche and the Social World. That's Dennis Brown and Louis Zinkin who edited that. Contemporary developments include recent attention to social change, the publication of comprehensive overviews of the group analytic field, interlinking theory and practice. This is John Schlapperberski's recent book. The appointment of an archivist, Kevin Power, the development of a group analytic dictionary, and scholarly research into Fuchs's background and past influences, as well as the ever-deepening roots of group analysis. We see a more confident and coherent location of group analysis in the relational frame, and an extension of the group analytic discourse into grappling with the core but ill-defined Fuchsian concepts of the social unconscious and the foundation matrix. Significant developments such as Hopper's extension of basic assumption theory to include collective defenses of massification and aggregation in response to fragmentation and annihilation anxiety in traumatized organizations and other large groups, this further enriches group analytic theory. These shifts, to me, are evidence of group analysis creatively adapting to a changing, globalized world. Now, to come back to what I sort of indicated earlier on as a concern of mine, group analysis in the digital age. It is the communications revolution, in my view, that presents group analysis with its greatest challenge yet. It is now a very familiar sight to see people plugged into their smartphones while traveling, whilst eating together, and in most other social and work situations. A more chilling sight is seeing mothers or fathers looking at their phones or iPads while feeding their babies and interacting with their toddlers. The effects of the internet and social media are regularly reported in the papers, dramatized in our TV serials. It permeates our social and political systems. It has infiltrated the fabric of our lives at all levels. Online connectivity and increasing internet use have been the subject of considerable attention and research in recent years. Research addresses effects on attentional processes, on learning, on memory, and effects of social media on the capacity for empathy, intimacy, relationships, and identity. Some of the known effects of online behavior are, for example, the disinhibiting effect of perceived anonymity, whereby people can be more trusting of others online, bolder, more self-disclosing, achieving a ready intimacy of a kind, and judgment impaired in the absence of real-life cues. Mary Aiken, who's an Irish associate professor, she's a psychologist, director of a research center on the internet, on cyberspace. She introduces terms such as cyber socialization to describe how online groups establish their own norms and rules of engagement, and cyber migration to describe how these norms might slowly filter back into real-life social behavior. There are many ways in which the internet enters our therapy groups. I'm sure we're all familiar with this. It is rare in recent years for a group member not to be carrying a smartphone into the group space, offering another potential source of boundary transgression. On occasions, problems of addiction to connecting and to gaming are discussed, as are the bewildering dynamics of internet dating. A member, this recently, brings into a real-life group his intense negative reaction to racist remarks by a Facebook friend. But this friend was known to him, he'd had contact with him in the real world, and questions how to deal with this, post a critical comment, to unfriend him, block him. I think this is an example of cyber migration, where social media transactions override real-life interactions. The advantages that technology brings to our lives are beyond question, and I think it is likely that it will, over time, expand man's cognitive and information processing capacities. We may become the superhuman intelligences Harari refers to in his futuristic novel, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. However, when excessively disembodied relating is not balanced by embodied interaction and relating, especially in the early years, and when sensory motor experience is reduced to two-dimensional visual and auditory cues, and click and swipe motor activities, we change the foundations of our emotional and cognitive development, potentially reducing the basis for creative and reflective thinking. Bion regarded the processing and containment of sensory experience as crucial to our developing capacity to think. In cyberspace, disembodied interactional networks rely on reduced sensory motor cues and reduced layers of meanings, and hence have a thinner, a less substantial texture, despite the extended reach of such networks and their greatly increased complexity. Spending excessive time in cyberspace, playing in the virtual world, with self-created avatars or with others, free from interference from authority and real-life cues and boundary constraints, is likely to reinforce Freud's primary process thinking that knows no time and space constraints, characteristic of unconscious process. Or, more recently, what Bateman and Fonagy describe as pre-reflective modes of thinking. Psychic equivalence mode, you think as I think, difficulty separating my mental state from your mental state. And pretend mode, a detachment from reality. Reflective thinking is at the heart of group analytic relational approaches. As group conductor analysts, we oscillate between intersubjective immersion and standing back and reflecting, the essence of the group analytic attitude. Although reflection can certainly take place in internet forums and discussion groups, the addictive pull towards continuous online connectivity may well in future decades compromise our reflective capacities. We need to counter this possible development by reinforcing a reflective mode in real-life groups. Turkle highlights the difference between connection and relationship between interacting subjects. She regards continual connection as undermining the capacity for solitude, self-reflection, and intimacy. She spent her 2 to 3 decades in doing field research on use of the internet. We can only speculate at this stage about the long-term effects on developing attachment bonds. But surely, when eye contact and face-to-face interaction in early years is reduced, when a distracting machine comes between mother and baby, and the reflective gaze in the mother's mirroring eyes turned away, the capacity to be sociable and to form deep and lasting attachments will inevitably be affected. The sense of belonging is different to mere connection. We belong in a different culture in cyberspace. We lose the possibility of a sensory belonging, and our relational belonging is impoverished. Aiken argues that the cyber self is a literally detached self, that the culture of taking selfies is proof of this objectification. By posting a selfie, you are required to experience yourself as an object that is presentable or not. You judge your selfie from a detached distance, even if it's posted impulsively. This self-objectification and the sense of detachment from true self could explain many of the negative behaviors seen online. It feeds dissociation. This is a quote from Aiken. Constructing profiles and posting on Facebook are further examples of this self-objectification process. Could our social media hall of mirrors be the endless repetition of the self-reflexive, objectified self, in contrast to the differentiated reflections from real-life others to our real-life self? I think such developments may well promote narcissistic and associative elements in the structuring of personalities. My primary concern is that all the above may facilitate an easy objectification and dehumanizing of the other, that we may become more machine-like and find it easier to destroy each other. The problem is not technology, but how it is used and what it is used for. So, finally, how does group analysis respond to this challenge, this paradigmatic shift in our way of being in the world? So these are my concluding remarks, meeting the challenge, just very soon, meeting the challenge of the digital age. I suggest 3 areas of creative development whereby we can retain our core assumptions and frame, our core identity, but adapt to the changing world around us. In our clinical work, I think we need to extend our multi-perspectival view of the person, the group, the matrix, to include the online self and the dynamics of relating in cyberspace, introducing a 5th viewing level alongside the current projective transference and primordial levels, a cyberspace level or domain. As online life is not directly visible, it needs decoding from reported experience and needs to be considered alongside contemporary and past relational experience. In addition, I suggest that for group analysis to creatively adapt to our digital age and our globalized networked world, we should enter into the field of public health, offering face-to-face groups, particularly for teenagers, as a prophylactic and counter to increasing time spent in cyberspace, whether it's in educational or other voluntary institutions or organizations, but not necessarily clinical, preventative. And in our theory building and Gestalt, theory building, our Gestalt systemic frame calls for further development. How do figure ground phenomena play out in cyberspace? We need to consider how boundaries that differ in quantitative texture, maybe elastic or brittle, porous or opaque, dissolving or fixed, that allow movement in one direction or both, that allow osmosis or leakage, how such boundaries operate in different mediums and cultures, and how to enhance the functions that they serve. What sort of boundaries best serve the therapeutic group in today's world? Or a host community absorbing immigrant groups? I leave you with such questions. And having started with Bob Dylan, I can't resist ending with a bard, and let Shakespeare have the final say. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. Thank you.